Hello, my name's Helena Leurent. I'm the Director General of Consumers International. I'm based here in Geneva, Switzerland. Our organization is in 100 countries around the world. So, Consumers International represents 200 consumer rights groups around the world. We're in 100 countries. Traditionally, and our organization is 60 years old, we have looked at consumer needs and rights across a whole range of different sectors. So in food, in finance, in energy, in mobility. And over 60 years, the efforts have primarily been around making sure that consumers have fair prices, that they have the right level of information to make good choices, that they have appropriate redress. Now, what we realize now and what we see now is that because of the onset of technologies, those sectors are changing profoundly. They are all changing profoundly because of a range of different technologies, that whether that's facial recognition, whether that's AR, VR, whether that's drones, you name it. And so the role of consumer advocacy is changing as well, because one, we have to make sure that as those technologies are introduced into different sectors, we're designing to make sure that consumers are protected and empowered. And also, frankly, as consumers have a greater awareness of the need for sustainable consumption, ideally, we make sure that those technologies are also driving towards meaningful innovation and the type of innovation, the type of change that empowers consumers, that builds trust, and that leads us towards the SDGs. Yeah, so some of the future and the big picture pieces, and you're asking at a great time because this is our 60th anniversary, and we asked all of our council for their vision for 2030. And I think what's really interesting is that, one, they recognize that over the past 60 years, there have been some incredible achievements. So we were some of the first to think about the responsible use of pesticides in food. We think long and hard about nutrition and labeling concerns for consumers. We were involved in tobacco control. Now, you can't sit on your laurels. We are currently in 2020 in the midst of a crisis, and we are facing multiple different types of crisis, whether it's sanitary and health, economic, or environmental. And this is all against a background of incredible change. So the role of consumer advocacy becomes, one, to be innovative and modern and be part of the solution. In terms of digital technologies, in terms of sustainable consumption. And there is a big call that one can see in the vision that consumer advocates have of collaboration, of working together to make sure that we have a global consumer voice. So the role of Consumers International becomes one of ensuring that consumers, not through the eyes of business, but the independent voice of consumers as an actor in the marketplace is represented as we think about policy, as we think about changes that need to be in place. And what I loved is that there's a great sense of optimism that together, working together with different stakeholders, that positive change can happen, and that we will see a healthier, safer, fairer, more sustainable marketplace where there is a greater empowerment of the consumer with and because of new technologies, in fact. So as we look to the future, I think the first thing to say is that there is huge opportunity. Consumer advocacy is well aware of the way in which technology can drive positive, meaningful innovation. The exciting piece is how much that can lead into opportunity and a better form of marketplace. Our work is trying to make sure that the way we move forward takes into consideration the fact that those opportunities should be available for everyone. First, as you look at the world now, 48% of the world isn't online. And that's not just an issue for emerging markets. You have a number of people in so-called high-income countries who would have problems with a fully digital financial services system, for example. They rely on cash. So we need to think about the digital divide and the impact that has. Secondly, as you look at technology and innovation across different sectors, it can be the case that technology exacerbates inequalities because the level of information about the consumer can be so much greater on the side of business than it is on the side of the individual consumer. So, for example, you can see ways in which data is collected and sold on and used in ways that we really don't understand or wouldn't have the time to understand. And that is a little bit like really pollution in the offline world, and we need to do our best to try and reduce it and eliminate that kind of practice as we all build together a really robust and fair and safe and sustainable online and digital economy. Yeah, so how do we involve people and how do we avoid some of those risks? You mentioned education of consumers. Awareness and education is absolutely critical, but it goes beyond that. It's about actually engaging with consumers in the design of these new technologies or approaches or services. It's bringing consumer advocacy, consumers into that upfront stage as opposed to it being at the backstage of the process. It's about having principles that think about vulnerable consumers at the very start. It's about making a level playing field so that the best practice becomes closer to the norm. I think there is, what's been really fascinating is the examples of startups that have said, well, actually, for the future, we're going to assume that some of the best practice in consumer advocacy is just the norm, the average way in which a business should approach development, and see that as a source of innovation. It's really exciting to see that. And I think it's a different way in which we can see technology development and engaging with consumers for the future. We see artificial intelligence impacting every single sector that touches consumers across food, across health, across finance, retail. I was just reading, I think it was a Gartner survey, that 3/4 of global retailers have incorporated artificial intelligence in the way that their operations run and their communication to consumers, or are planning to incorporate that by the end of this year. Now, I think you have to have a balanced approach to this. The opportunity for artificial intelligence and ways of using data more appropriately are very great. One can imagine that brings very significant opportunities in terms of being more efficient, of personalization, of ways in which we can really find the next level of services and products for consumers. But at the same time, there are really very real risks and challenges that we absolutely have to be thinking through. And what we've seen is that in the majority of cases, even though governments are thinking through ethics systems and policies at a national level, the level of engagement and bringing in other stakeholders to consider these is not enough. And the real risks are, of course, that you can see discrimination happening. You can see online scams happening, increasingly so, because people are more reliant on online services. And you can see vulnerable consumers and vulnerable people being harmed by greater ability to target, and just the sort of not just a lack of ethical underpinning of what's happening, but also an inability to test what's happening in the marketplace. So, for example, in the past, you might have been able to do mystery shopping to see what is actually happening in the marketplace and the consumer experience. That can become so much more difficult when it comes to the current online environment. How do we build a better marketplace that takes into account some of these technologies? I think there's a starting point to remember that we are the ones designing this for ourselves. It is a moment, and we're very fortunate to have that moment and recognition that we are going through an industrial revolution, and we can shape that together. And I think we've got a realization of what the sort of the unique moment in time and the power of the technologies that we now have at our fingertips. So with that as a backdrop, it's really using some of the platforms at global level, like the Global Partnership on AI, or at regional or local level, to say what is it that we want and make sure that those conversations are inclusive. As we think through these things, typically, considering the all aspects of the problem. So the security side of things, the environmental picture, the need to consider vulnerable consumers, some of the broader concepts that need to be built in as we build ethics systems for ourselves. Now, of course, recently we've seen a huge burgeoning in the number of principles written by countries or companies. I think the Harvard Berkman Klein Center looked at about 80 of them. So that's not enough. It's about then saying, well, how do we make sure that those are enforced? How do we create the ways in which we can test whether those are in place? How do we create the systems to see whether in the marketplace you are actually experiencing discrimination? How do we, poke and prod the system to see what's happening and make sure that it's working for us? And that should be a virtuous loop. I think that's really the way in which you can see that moving forward. And over time, the regulation we need to have in place needs to keep up to the extent it can with the pace of technological change, so that companies that are moving forward and doing the right thing are supported in the right way. So with a consumer advocacy hat on, there are great benefits to being able to get fairer, safer, and more sustainable. If I think, if I can really make my energy use more efficient, if I can make my car usage more efficient, if I can introduce meaningful innovation into my life that makes my experience better, potentially cheaper, more sustainable, then that's fantastic. If we think about, for example, car safety, the way in which now I can drive my Tesla, I can have automatic driving, I can reduce human error in road safety. That could, there are very significant benefits that could be developed. The point that I think consumer advocates would make is that typically you won't know whether these things really are fair, safe, and sustainable in practice unless you incorporate people who are thinking that way about consumer rights from the outset, and really sort of road testing, to continue the metaphor, new innovations to see, is this actually going to work in reality? And let's make sure that we're starting from the perspective of the consumer with rights for the marketplace, as opposed to the consumer as a target for business development. Probably the biggest barrier to adoption of some of these products by consumers is just looking at what happens with my data. We have looked at consumer attitudes towards connected products. And of course, many are, really excited about the way in which those products fulfill a need. For consumers who, even for those who do buy those products, there is a little bit of a feeling that these are creepy. It's the term that they use, and this was a study from around the world. For those who don't buy connected products, there's that feeling of mistrust as well. And when you try and unpick that lack of trust, it's about, where does my data go? But also, am I the product? What's the business model behind this? There's a really interesting sense amongst consumers about what a product really does to your environment and your experience. So in order for a greater sort of extent or greater use of those types of products, we would need to overcome that lack of trust. And what we've found is that you can build trust if you build in from the very beginning, in the design of this, the levels of transparency, security, attention to vulnerable consumers, attention to environmental impact, the things that perhaps should not be left to the very end of the process, but considered at the very start. And that openness and that consideration of a broader set of criteria can help build trust. I would also say that it's about thinking, when is the product truly needed? When is it meaningful innovation? When is this something which actually improves the everyday life of the consumer? And think about their broader aspirations. I don't think, I would say there are the beginnings of conversations about how to build trust by design. I don't think we have gone far enough. At Consumers International, we've had some great conversations with Vodafone, for example, about how to build a trust by design approach. We've also supported the Cybersecurity Tech Accord to help them think through, how do you raise consumer awareness of the cybersecurity issues. What we're not really doing so far is thinking holistically about where where we can, from the outset, protect consumers. Because if we rely too much on consumer awareness, no consumer can ever really understand some of the issues in the way IoT works, and those change all the time. So I think there's a whole different style of conversation that needs to be had. The current pandemic and health crisis has exacerbated inequalities and problems for consumers around the world. And it's made us even more dependent on the digital economy. At the same time, it's created a moment of reflection and a window of, if not opportunity, then an opportunity for us to think about the way in which we build our marketplace and how we build a marketplace that is inclusive and fair and safe and sustainable. We know that that will depend on listening and working in partnerships which are unusual. And I think it's a real moment for us to be courageous about that and explore new ways of innovating in a meaningful way for people and for planet. I do feel that there is something really positive happening. Perhaps it's because we have a next generation who are more aware of the urgency and need for change. Perhaps it's because we have more people who've needed to pick up jobs in different sectors and in different walks of life. But I think there is a breaking down to some extent of some of the silos between government, business, civil society, and others. But that is slow. And there is still a certain silo effect where we mistrust the way in which others think and their motivations. And to partner across those silos is seen as unusual, and it definitely takes time. I feel quite strongly that the level of innovation comes from thinking outside your own boundaries and seeing things from a different perspective. Working with partners you wouldn't necessarily normally consider working with absolutely helps you identify new innovations. The types of unusual partnerships you can see are, between business, civil society, government, addressing a very significant problem with a shared objective. And I think those need to be moving far faster and far further right now. So in my head, I say unusual partnerships, they shouldn't be unusual. This should be a normal way of practice would be looking for opportunities to innovate with people who don't think quite the same way or don't have the same mental frameworks, because that is really where we'll see progress.